I invited you, Craig. The floor is yours, and you already shared with me that you hope for a very interactive session. So please raise your hand when you have any questions.
Well, that's a first to be described as the King of Scotland, so I'm not sure if my colleagues back home would agree with that, but thank you so much, Visha, for inviting me to this board meeting. It goes without saying, I mean, I've travelled to the Netherlands on numerous occasions over the years, and it's always such a delight to be here, to be invited here, because undoubtedly the work that's emanated out of the Netherlands over the last 10, 20 years or so in the Alzheimer's space has been impactful around the globe. I think the world looks to some of the initiatives that take place within the Netherlands as really having a huge influence on our thinking and our understanding of neurodegenerative disease, not just in terms of the biology, but also in terms of, I think, as this program is setting out, the impact it can have for the well-being of people living with dementia, and of course a key concern that we all have of trying to prevent dementia before it develops into a symptomatic stage. So I haven't had a chance to update my slides to say the quadruple helix. We talked about this last night at dinner, but there is this notion that many of you are aware of the triple helix, which is this consideration of getting the best out of academia, the health system, and life sciences to really come together to address major societal or healthcare challenges. And what I'm going to do over the next maybe 35, 40 minutes or so is very much talk about my own personal journey. Hopefully I'm going to maybe even overshare, as my children would say, some of the challenges, some of the motivations, some of the pain points that I've had over this last little while in terms of trying to have that impact on patient well-being that Visha mentioned. So it's probably worthwhile disclosing my interest. I've worked, like many others, very, very, very closely with industry over the last maybe 20 years of my life. I'm very proud of that. I think there's a discussion to be had about disclosures and about conflicts of interest. I think sometimes we overdo that. We talked last night over dinner about this. We're not going to name any names. But I think industry brings a huge amount of value to our ecosystem in terms of not just their resources, but their insights, their intelligence, and also at the end of the day, diagnostic tests and drugs are going to be developed by our industry partners. They might not be discovered by them, but they're certainly delivered by them. So having a mature relationship with industry, I think, is absolutely critical. And we learned a lot about that relationship. I'll talk more about it later. In the EPAD program, in the AMIPAD program, which are explicitly public-private partnerships. And I know this audience is a combination of academics, healthcare, and industry people, so it's a good example of a triple helix audience, if you like. I'm also the CEO and founder, majority shareholder of this new company, which I set up 18 months ago, called Scottish Brain Sciences. I was told I had to stand in the middle. Is that still, so I go back. I feel very exposed here. I wanted to hide behind the lectern desperately, but here we go. So this is a slide I'm going to show you 2 or 3 times during the course of this presentation. But this in some ways is my own personal journey over the last 10 years. I'm going to talk about each of these elements in due course. So a few weeks ago in London, we had the 10-year birthday party of the Prevent Dementia program, which was therefore started in 2014. And this was a cohort study. First cohort study I was chief investigator on, which looked at a population of individuals 40 to 59 years old, and was funded by the Alzheimer's Society to look very specifically at brain changes related to risk factors in midlife, so 40 to 59 years old. And that's been running successfully for this last 10 years. I'll talk a little bit about that project and some of the science and knowledge that's emerged from it. A couple of years later, 2015, 2016, we initiated EPAD. Just a show of hands, just to get them to interact. Who's either worked on EPAD or knows about EPAD? And can you, Casper, so I know you worked there. Okay, so it's probably about a third of the room. So I'll talk a little bit about EPAD and also some of the papers that have come out of that over the last little while. As Visha said, 2019, I had an audience, and I'll talk more about this in due course, with the First Minister of Scotland, to really sort of reflect a lot of the knowledge that we were gathering from both the Prevent Dementia Programme and EPAD and other studies around the world, was, if you like, mature enough to maybe start putting into practice, to implement the science. And the First Minister agreed with this. This is where we set up something called Brain Health Scotland, which was hosted by Alzheimer's Scotland, which is our charity in Scotland for Alzheimer's and dementia, but also hosted in a sense by, or funded by Scottish Government. So I think it's probably the first government-backed initiative for brain health anywhere in the world. Government-led, I should say. And then 18 months ago, I set up Scottish Brain Sciences, which I'll talk about again in a bit more detail. Yeah, so Scottish Brain Sciences, just to give you a little bit of a sweetener, if you like, of what the company is. Our vision is to detect and treat brain diseases and enable better brain health for all. So, as you all be aware, companies have visions and mission statements and purposes, and this is our vision. And you recognise that's kind of the same vision as EPAD, kind of the same vision as Brain Health Scotland. So there's a continuity that goes through the projects that I've been fortunate enough to lead over the years. And I changed my Twitter strapline a few months ago, but what we used to say was same destination, different vehicle. So all we were trying to do, all I was trying to do is exactly what I've been trying to do the last 20, 30 years of my career, but do it through a commercial vehicle rather than necessarily through sort of a public body. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, obviously. This was a really important publication that was generated from within Scotland, which most of these kind of reports don't really get read. There's a lot of effort, there's a lot of time and commitment from various parties to generate reports, but they often end up on a shelf and people don't necessarily use them or refer back to them as maybe they should do. The Campbell report, which was published about 2 or 3 years ago, for me, as the name suggests, was a roadmap. It was almost like a guidebook for how we execute the triple helix approach in Scotland for life sciences. And there was a variety of different recommendations that were contained within this report. Things like, what should industry do? What should the life sciences sector do? What should they provide? What's their role within the triple helix? What's the role of the health system within the triple helix? And what's the role of the universities? And it was actually quite specific. So we're talking about things like sharing PhD studentships or postdoctoral programs, industry funding, postdoctoral programs, for instance, healthcare systems being accommodating of innovation within life sciences. And I saw this as actually, before I set up the company, I recognised that what there wasn't in this triple helix for Alzheimer's within Scotland was a dedicated life sciences company. So you have lots of life sciences companies that will maybe develop a drug or develop a test or develop some sort of algorithm. But there wasn't one company whose purpose was to cure Alzheimer's disease. Okay? So that's why I thought there was a gap in the market, if you like, and I sought to fill that. So this is the way I think about that 10 years of my life, if you like, my work life. Prevent Dementia and EPAD were the foundation, scientific foundation. Brain Health Scotland in 2019 was an attempt with the implementation. It led to a bit of frustration. And that's why in 18 months ago, I set up Scottish Brain Sciences to be the acceleration on this program. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about a comfort zone for all of us. Scientific foundation. I'm going to show you some data. Okay? So I obviously don't need to spend too much time to this audience about what Alzheimer's disease is. But one of the key reasons I show this slide, and this is the building up the narrative, if you like, is that over 100 years ago, when Alzheimer first described in regards to the Alzheimer's pathology, what he was, of course, describing was a brain disease. Okay, now, by the way, as Ritchie mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm always getting criticised by that, by Philip Shelton's. He says, you're so desperate to be a neurologist, aren't you? No, I'm a psychiatrist. but I'm very biological, even as a psychiatrist. And, 100 plus years ago, this was a brain disease. And over the course of the last century, up until maybe 20, 30 years ago, we weren't able to define that brain disease through biology, because we didn't have brain imaging, we didn't have access to CSF, proteomics, or blood-based biomarkers. So necessarily, the condition became a phenomenological condition. It was defined by symptoms rather than by disease. Now, that was necessary and appropriate probably until the late 1990s, when one could argue that because of the advent of better brain imaging, because of the advent of access to CSF and proteomics, and you'll hear obviously a lot more about that from Charlotte later on today, that should have been a eureka moment for the field, when they should have said, wow, great, we can define this, like in most branches of medicine, we can define this malignant, inevitably fatal brain disease on biomarkers representing pathology, rather than necessarily the clinical symptoms that emerge. And the reason that's important is not just it's the right thing to do, because in medicine we try to define things by disease, or disease processes, but also because symptoms emerging is a very late stage of the disease condition. So what we recognized, scientifically at least, was that there's a disease process that had preceded the onset of symptoms by maybe 20 or 30 years. And where we were clinically was, in a sense, at the palliative care stage of the illness. Hence the reason why the therapies that we have been testing, or we have had very little impact on prognosis. Because you're actually, even with disease-modifying therapies given late, you're still really only providing symptomatic benefit. What you're not doing is really changing fundamentally the course of the disease in its early stages. Now, if you work in cancer, or you work in infectious diseases, HIV, whatever it might be, what we recognize is you want to go in early. You want to identify illnesses as soon as possible. Now, as soon as possible for us, in terms of amyloidosis or tau spread, is probably in your 50s and 60s. Okay? Hence the reason for preventing EPAD. So scientifically, what we were doing was we were shifting our gaze earlier to the course of disease, through course like Abort, like Prevent, like EPAD, etc., to say what's happening in the brain of these individuals in midlife or early, older adulthood that is actually relative to risk factors, be they genetic or lifestyle or comorbidities, that we can observe and maybe identify ways of targeting those early stages of disease to cure the condition. Most cancers, if they're picked up early enough, are cured. Not ameliorated, not held in remission, but cured. So we should have, I think, the same ambition with Alzheimer's. Why shouldn't we? We should try and cure it. We should cure it by picking it up earlier. So that was the science. That's really cool. We have no impact in some ways by just publishing papers in the New England Journal of Medicine. What you need to do is see how can you actually move clinical services and the population and the public to this new narrative, this new way of thinking. Because if you can do that, then of course you can prevent dementia. So one of the projects, and I've only got a few slides on the science, one of the big projects, again, many of you were involved with, and the Netherlands played a key part in, was EPAD, European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia. And what I think it was recognised by IMI, by the European Union, was that story I just told you, that you need to get in early, you need to find ways of detecting disease early, you need to put in therapeutic interventions to try and change the course of disease substantially. Now, for those who know EPAD, you'll recall, of course, that this was meant to be a platform for drug trials, but unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, we never actually initiated the drug trials, despite a lot of effort in designing the adaptive trial platform. But what we did do was assemble a very large cohort of individuals, research participants, well over 2,000 people. But what we also did was assembled a huge number of colleagues who all, dare say, either believed what I just told you about early detection, or willing to believe it. And we built a community. We built an incredible community. At one point during the project, there were 420 people working on EPAD across the world. There's a lot of American colleagues as well in the program. And what we did through the EPADista community, I think, built up a huge amount of support for each other in the belief that this can be done, and also installation of hope amongst this academic research community that I think has certainly driven me forward, but I'm not alone. There's a lot of people who shared this ambition that we can have that impact. So EPAD in some ways satisfied two things, and a third thing to come. First was generating knowledge. Second was building a community. But the third, and I think the most important thing that came out of EPAD, were the 2,000 participants in the study. What did we do? We didn't just collect data and CSF from them. We listened to them. We listened to what they wanted, what their expectations were, what their hope was, why they participated in EPAD, what it was that they were expecting us to do for them in many ways, or even better still, with them. And it's actually those conversations, when I spoke to the First Minister in 2019, I didn't talk to her about p-values or about brain changes, what have you. I communicated, I was a channel for the narrative that was coming from participants, their hope, their expectations. What's my risk? What can I do about it? How can I change my own brain health? How can I make sure this never happens to my children? And those were the things I spoke to the First Minister about. So, the EPAD program, 2,000 plus people in the cohort study, probably the largest collection of CSF ever assembled, because as you all know from bitter experience, you've got lumbar punctures and everybody. And that data and those biosamples are being used, I'm glad to say, all over the world in developing new knowledge. It was also important in many ways as a stimulus to the AMIPAD project, which again I'm sure many of you are involved with, which was hosted here, hosted in Amsterdam by Frederick Barkhoff. And it's also now being a partner, if you like, in the EPND project, again, run by P.T. Eller here in Amsterdam, not here in Amsterdam, but in Amsterdam. And this is quite gratifying, because when we set up this project, it was explicit that we should prioritize data sharing. So unlike a lot of other cohort studies, who will embargo data for a long period of time, even charge people for accessing data, it was written into the kind of EPAD world that the minute the data is available for sharing, the quality controlled and checked, etc., that it should be shared. And I'm glad to say that there's been, and this is maybe a few weeks old now, this slide, but 157 data access requests have come from EPAD. And if anybody here has used the EPAD data, hands up if you have. You should be able to access it within about 2 or 3 hours of making the application. Not months, not years, no fee, no tariff. The way we set up the system, which cost a lot of money, by the way, the way we set up the system was so that it should be easy to use for people around the world. And that's why, not enough yet, but 4 in Sub-Saharan Africa, 4 South America, 7 in Asia. These are low, middle income countries for accessing these data sets. And it gives them hope, it gives them aspiration, it gives them the right, if you like, quite rightly so, to join the community of academics around the world. The vast majority are still in Europe, and the vast majority are between Edinburgh, Barcelona, and Amsterdam. But that's where the leadership came from for the project. So we'd like to see that change over time, and maybe through EPND, etc., we'll be able to do that. So just want to share with you about the Prevent Dementia program. Again, it's our scientific foundations, if you like. This is the group, like I said, of 700 individuals. Half have a family history of dementia, the other half don't. Collected over 5 centres in the UK and Ireland. We're also just, well, maybe a year or two ago, started a programme with another interest of ours, a keen interest of mine, which is contact sports. So we have a cohort of 61 professional rugby players, almost exactly shared 50-50 men and women. So these are elite athletes from rugby. And we've got a grant from FIFA to look at 120 odd international professional football players, again, equally distributed men and women. That allows us, with the 700, if you like, in the control group, to really understand what the biology and impact of playing professional sport is on brain health. And there's some really cool data coming out of that already, which should be published in the summer. So I'm just going to, not that I probably need to for this audience, but this is a kind of a validation of that early slide I showed you, that there are changes in midlife related to risk of dementia in later life. So I'm just going to show you 3 or 4 papers, if you like, come out of the dozens that have emerged from both Prevent and EPAD. So Mariolina Janavi, who works at John O'Brien's group in Cambridge. And John O'Brien, who many of you know, he runs the imaging subcommittee within Prevent. And what she demonstrated was that in hippocampal subfields related to ApoE status, in this cohort in Prevent, the mean age is 52. On the basis of your ApoE status, you were already beginning to see atrophy in key regions of the brain related to your genetic risk of dementia in later life. So subtle changes in the area which subserves, visuospatial function, and also an area we know from Braak staining to be early affected by tau. We're seeing in 50-year-olds, people in their early 50s, which is now younger than me, unfortunately, the emergence of some changes, some pathological changes in the brain. Now, this was a cross-sectional study. We need to, obviously, we've got the follow-up data being analysed as we speak. But already you're beginning to see an indication that, as we hypothesized, Alzheimer's disease or those at high risk of dementia, at least, is emerging in people in their early 50s. What she also looked at was, in her particular interest, actually in blood flow. I know this is a very, very busy slide, but the take-home message is that actually blood flow in the major cerebral arteries actually increases in people related to ApoE4 status, which seems somewhat paradoxical to what we know about blood flow in later stages of disease. And what this actually, I think, indicates is that what we learn by looking at the brains or the performance of people in later life may not be true across the whole course of the illness. There might be changes early in the course of disease which are actually at odds or even completely opposite to changes later on. And this implies in some ways that there may be even further upstream changes in the brain for which these things are a response to. So an increase in blood flow might be a response to something else. The other paper we talked about, the menopause, last night, some of the work I think, Casper, you're doing, I said there's a menopause paper in here. This was actually one of probably, I was going to say almost one of the most gratifying projects that I was involved with. Number one was on EPAD data. Number two is from investigators who were nothing to do with EPAD. So they set a hypothesis and they'd access the data set. It was about women's health, which is important, and I think is really impactful. So what Rasha Soleil at the University of East Anglia in Norwich did was looked at the EPAD data set, the women within the EPAD data set, and effectively looked at those who had or had not had hormone replacement therapy. And what she discovered was that those who had ApoE4 and HRT had the best brain health in terms of neuroimaging, as well in terms of cognitive function. So we have other data, and I think you'll be aware of this, obviously, that ApoE4 is probably very good for your brain up until a certain age, maybe in your 40s and 50s. And in women, that benefit of ApoE4 status seems to be preserved or maintained if you have HRT. So this had the headlines in the UK in January last year when it was released. And there was a lot of discussion about, there's a whole issue, I'm sure it's the same in the Netherlands, about HRT and its benefits and how we should be managing or helping to support women with their decision about HRT or not. And I think this should be thrown into the equation. The HRT, to my mind, seems to be beneficial for brain health, particularly if you've got a family history or you're ApoE4 positive. And this is the data. So quite fascinating, again, to build and back up this hypothesis that ApoE4, number one, may be a benefit in midlife, or up until midlife, and number two, there are interventions which seem to affect the course of disease in those individuals, interventions which are in some ways freely available to women around the world. So looking at the gestalt, if you like, of the publications and the data that's come out of EPAD and Prevent thus far, my kind of view is that they're both cognitive and structural changes in the brain that represent an AD signature in midlife tech. The hypothesis that we had 10, 15 years ago that there'd be changes in the brain, I think has been confirmed. The other thing, and there's a lot more data I could share with you on this, is there are very important sex differences in the way we look at the data, in the way that the data was coming forward. And in many ways, what we're now doing in preventing EPAD is using sex and/or gender, not just as covariates in the analysis, but actually stratifying the analysis. Men and women are different because there's such different profiles when you look at midlife. We have this notion of two rivers, one estuary. When you actually get to later life, those differences between men and women come together. Whereas earlier on, upstream, if you like, it seems to be very different disease processes. I've mentioned a few times that athletes may confer resilience up until the 5th decade. And we're working on our imaging data in particular on other aspects of great matter changes, the locus coeruleus, which we've got some really nice data coming out as the locus coeruleus, which obviously connects very strongly to the hippocampus, is probably where the disease starts. The problem is it's hard to image the locus coeruleus. And then also some changes that we're seeing from a connectivity perspective. So my good friend Karen Ritchie, not relation, she was born in Tasmania, I was born in Aberdeen, couldn't be further apart, but we worked together very closely. Despite that, we wrote this paper with several others back in 2015. It was published, where we asked the question, the rhetorical question, is late onset Alzheimer's disease really a disease of midlife? And I think categorically now the answer is yes. And it's funny actually now you wouldn't even pose that question, but 10 years ago there was debate. In the first grant that we got from the Alzheimer's Society, the biggest criticism we got from the panel was, why are you going so young? To which Karen, by the way, who's co-PI, said, we're not going young enough. But I think there was, for those who are old enough to remember, 10, 15 years ago, prevention, brain health, these were not in our lexicon. We were talking about symptoms, we were talking about nursing homes, we were talking about institutional care, we were talking about symptomatic treatments. So I think it's really gratifying. We talked about this from the Geneva meeting we had a few weeks ago, how gratifying it is that the world has moved on, almost without noticing. But some of us, 10, 15 years ago, were having to push a rock up a hill to get prevention, to get brain health into the agenda. So 2019, like I said, with my friend Henry Simmons, who's the Chief Executive of Alzheimer's Scotland, had a meeting with the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and spent probably an hour and a half with her. She was very accommodating, she's very receptive, she's incredibly intelligent, very insightful. Despite what you may think of her politics, she's smart, and she really understood what we were trying to do, what we were trying to achieve. And as a consequence of that, we established, like I said, Brain Health Scotland. And you'll see already that the way that we branded, marketed, socialised Brain Health Scotland was quite different to how you would normally communicate things about dementia. So for instance, it's not called Dementia Prevention Scotland. It's called Brain Health Scotland. It's positive, it's about health, it's about the brain, it's about the organ. It's not about clinical syndrome. Okay. And some of the programs we've done, which I won't show you the details of them now, but for instance, there's a program that we run for school children in Scotland, where 40,000 school children in Scotland had taken part in what's called the STARS program. And the STARS program is based on that observation that there's more connections in your brain than there are stars in the galaxy. So we use stars as a kind of a metaphor for brain health. Your stars are shining, your stars are dimming. If you eat this food, if you sleep well, your stars will shine. If you knock your head, not good for your stars. These sorts of things. That's actually the national curriculum for Scottish school children, to have education about brain health, which I'm incredibly proud of. And Anna, actually, who some of you may remember, she was involved in EPAD as well, led that program. Now the reason for saying all that, other than being very proud of something in the national curriculum in Scotland that relates to brain health, is that if we call it the Dementia Prevention Program, how many 11-year-olds are going to turn up to that meeting? Well, I'm 11. It's like, I'll worry about this in 70 years' time. But people across the life course understand what the brain is. In fact, it's the only organ in the body that a child can actually point to. If you say, where's your heart? Kids will point anywhere in their chest. Where's your liver? They'll get it completely wrong. My dad still gets it wrong. Is it over there? No, it's over there. Everyone knows where the brain is. Probably from the age of 5, kids know where their brains are. So it's in some ways that organ has most salience for children because they understand where a brain is, what it does, and they want to keep it healthy. So they take actions accordingly. So anyway, that's a bit of fun. Actually, another sort of side story. So when we actually set up this STARS program, we actually commissioned some, and I wish I had some slides in it now. We had some animators who we wanted to commission to run the cartoons and what have you, because it's all lovely little sort of cartoons and animations. And we actually found a company in Barcelona, Catalonia, who agreed to do it, and they charged us, they looked at it, it was like €65,000 or something. And then as they got deeper and deeper into it, they said, you know what, we'll just do it for nothing. Because they really believed in what we were trying to do too. So they did all of their work, and their passion for what we were trying to do came through by them just waiving the fee. So I'm not saying that I should probably advertise that in case somebody wants to go and say, hey, I hear you did this for free. But what we have done is, I can share the links later. I mean, all the materials are actually free. There's no IP. So if people want to put them into Dutch, please do so. So that's one part of what Brain Health Scotland does, and I'll explain a little bit more detail with some of the other stuff in a minute. But this is the paper that we published in JPAD a couple of years back, and I felt it was important to sort of underpin our clinical care pathway development work with some deep thought on what we were trying to do. And again, this community that came out of EPAD, so people like Giovanni Frassoni, Elizabeth Monievo, etc., we all kind of got together and came up with a kind of pre-consensus for what a brain health clinic should look like. And that's obviously emerged with various papers that Giovanni's led on. But it made sure that when we talked about brain health clinics, we were kind of talking about the same thing. And that's just developing so much amazing momentum right now. But this is a Scottish model. But I think one of the things which is important in terms of impact, which of course this meeting's all about, is that it's not just the people with early disease that we're trying to detect. What we're trying to do, which is, if you like, secondary prevention. What we're trying to do with Brain Health Scotland, what we are doing in some ways, is going right through the community at all ages, and what we call the Brain Health Pyramid. And what I've just described, for instance, with that schools program, is a public health program for people, for it's like, it's not even primary prevention, it's something like zero prevention. You're trying to stop them getting the risk factor in the first instance. But moving up through that pyramid, we then look at specific targeted populations. So within Brain Health Scotland, we have a particular program in connection with actually the police for women who are subject to intimate partner violence, because the risk of head injury in a woman, and therefore the risk of dementia, is much, much higher than the very celebrated and very visible head injuries you see in contact sport. But in women, it's also a lot more invisible, but probably much more damaging and impactful. So, and we also work, as you know, or as I mentioned earlier, with elite or ex-professional rugby and football players, and I do a clinic in Murrayfield, a brain health clinic for ex-rugby players. At the very top of that pyramid is the clinic. So it's not an isolated clinical service, it's in context of a sort of a systems-wide approach to brain health across the country. And that's why the government has to bring in multiple agencies, the police, education, public health, into this community. And that's been one of the big challenges in many ways. Because when Brain Health Scotland started, it was sitting within the Mental Health Directorate of the Scottish Government, which I think is entirely wrong for a whole bunch of different reasons. This is not a mental illness. It shouldn't be sitting, if you like, within the same governance structure as schizophrenia and suicide prevention. It should be sitting, I think, in its own space, a brain health directorate. And that's something I've been pushing hard for within the Scottish Government, is to create a brain health directorate, which brings in all these different agencies, including course, the life sciences sector. So I won't bore you with this, but this is obviously our care pathway for the clinic. It's in the paper. But I think the things that I would pick out of that are, number one, is open access. The clinic is open access. So you can walk into one of what we call our brain health hubs. You don't have to get a GP referral. You can just say, I've got concerns about my brain health, and you can be seen by what we call a brain health guide. And the second key point is to use the triage points. You know, that person doesn't get seen by a brain health guide and then get a PET scan. So you have steps through from the brain health guide to the clinic nurse to the clinic specialist through into sort of final early detection. The other key point in this is data collection and also offering people to participate in research. Now this is the ideal, and in 2020, something called the Programme for Government, which is the kind of statute, if you like, for what government will do over the next 5 years. It was noted that everybody in Scotland should have access to a brain health clinic by 2025. There's only one clinic open in Aberdeen. Okay? So despite even the government saying, we have to do this, when you actually when the rubber hits the road, as they say, in the health boards and the hospitals and etc., they go, yeah, we're a bit busy, there's other things, you know. So even government, I know there's people from government here, but even government backing doesn't always equate to action. So that led to, I didn't have on my slide, I had foundation, I had implementation and acceleration, but what's driven me more than anything else is frustration. That you have these ideas, you get partnerships, you get people going, yeah, that's a really brilliant idea, including the First Minister. But the reality is, operationally, things just don't move as quickly as you would like. Hence Scottish Brain Sciences, in many ways, because I felt that, you know, I turned 55 last year, I'd probably got 10 years left, and I didn't feel that all that we were doing collectively and personally was having the impact that we'd saw. So, you know, I didn't graduate medical school wanting to be CEO of a company, but I just did an analysis of where we were at and thought maybe this is a final roll of the dice. Can we actually put into that triple helix or quadruple helix a dedicated, passionate, you know, life sciences company? And that's what Scottish Brain Sciences was. So I refer back to this triple helix notion. I refer back to the Campbell report, which, like I said, was almost my eureka moment when I read it. I thought, this makes sense. I can see this. You know, I've been a doctor, or I am a doctor. I am an academic. I am now a CEO. I am the triple helix.